We could, if we could have everybody's attention, please. It is absolutely magnificent to have this sort of crowd.
We salute you.
Absolutely. I think everybody likes a good war story. I'm Ron Fuller. I'm the, I guess this year, the outgoing chairman of the, or president, if you will, of the Garland County Historical Society. And we are so honored to have all of you here this morning, or this afternoon, if you will, to hear my fellow Hot Springs High graduate and longtime friend, Colonel Hugh Mills. Before we get started, let me see the hands of everybody who has served in the military.
For over 60 years.
Look at that. Let me see the hands of all of the people, the families who've had someone who served in the military. Look at that. Thank you so much for coming this morning, and we're also especially proud to have all these Hot Springs High School graduates here this morning. How many Hot Springs High grads do we have? Look at that. Look at that. Glad to have you here. Class of 66. All right, Alex. Look at that. Well, we're very fortunate to all be so vertical. Okay. With that said, we don't have any announcements this morning as to voting or anything, but I would like you to stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Thanks to all the volunteers who are here this morning and the wonderful folks here at the library that always make all of this happen. So with that, I'll turn it over to our executive director.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, I don't talk quite as loud as Ron, so I'll use this. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to welcome a special guest, his brother, Jim Mills. Jim, where are you? Okay, Jim has come down here from Rogers, Arkansas to be with us today. Thank you, Jim. We're very glad to have you here today. It is such an honor to introduce our speaker today, particularly on this weekend when we pay tribute to our veterans. Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Mills is one of the, if not the most, decorated pilots of the Vietnam War, in which he served 3 tours of duty, shot down 16 times, and wounded 3 times. Well, my little button isn't working here, Paul.
You got it.
You got it.
Yes. He was awarded so many decorations and awards. We don't have time to list them all today, but they include 3 Silver Stars, the Legion of Merit, 4 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 3 Bronze Stars, 1 for valor in ground combat, 12 Air Medals for combat hours, and 6 for personal valor. It's just incredible. And his experiences led to his writing of a wonderful memoir, which I highly recommend to everybody, called Low Level Hell, a Scout Pilot in the Big Red One. And they can get that on Amazon, can't they?
Yep. Order all you want.
He's been inducted into the U.S. Army Aviation Hall of Fame. And not only that, his last combat helicopter is flying from the ceiling of that museum. That's how special that is. He's also been inducted into the Gathering of Eagles, the U.S. Army OSC Hall of Fame, the Arkansas Aviation Hall of Fame, the Arkansas Combat Veterans Hall of Fame, and he's also enshrined on the Arkansas Walk of Fame. After his retirement from the Army in 1993, he served as Kansas City Police Department commander and undersheriff of Jackson County, Missouri, and did a lot of other wonderful things as well. But, Hot Springs proudly claims Hugh. He's the son of Don McCullum Mills and the late Dr. Hugh Mills, who was superintendent of schools here from 59 to 67. Now, if you were attending Hot Springs High School back in the day, hello Trojans, you would have seen Hugh on the basketball court or in student council meetings or presiding over us seniors as president of the class of 1966. He was just a wonderful, friendly guy. Little did we know that before a year was up after we graduated, he'd have joined the Army, that he'd be commissioned at age 19, and that he'd be in Vietnam at age 20. And he would be on a path of service that is as inspirational as it is exceptional. Please welcome our friend, our Trojan president, and a true American hero, Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Mills.
Thank you. Go and sit down. Most of you are too old to stand up anyway. Couple of thoughts before I start. This is a special place for me because the last time I was here, this was Rick's Stadium. That's the last time I stood on this ground. For those of you who don't know that, this is where the Trojans played football. And they tore the stadium down and built this library. The oldest classmates of mine, in addition to Ron Fuller, Gary and Pat Jones are back here, so raise your hand, Gary, right over here. Ramble Elementary School, no longer there, 6th grade in Ramble. And we lived up on Circle Drive, just off of Park Avenue for a year. And then Mother and Dad bought a house out on 2nd Street. And so I did my junior high at Southwest. And then there was only one high school, what we used to call the old high school. Now I guess it's the old high school. But so many people that were pivotal in my life are sitting in this room, and I want to name a couple of them. I did a podcast for Black Rifle Coffee, if you guys know who they are, a couple of months ago down in Texas, and they asked me, other than your parents, who were the most influential people in your life? And I said, my coaches. And they said, do you remember any of them? And the first name I said was Ronnie Cheshire. And Ronnie Cheshire's sitting right back here. Coach, raise your hand. Coach Ron Cheshire. Ronnie Cheshire, Dick Dameron, George Christianos, Ben Burton, Forrest Johnson, Ben Johnson, all coaches that to me as a young guy in junior high and high school, those were the guys. And then of course, those of us who went to Hot Springs High School, Johnny May Mackey. I may not be the only one in the room that got swats from Johnny May Mackey, but I did. Teddy Orrell caused it. It was his fault. And I'm not going to tell you what I did, but for the superintendent's kid to get wax in the principal's office, it was inspirational. But my classmates from the class of 66 are here. We've got a Huey pilot here. God knows where he came from. He's probably lost. We got a Cav Scout pilot, did the same thing I did later on. We have the older sister of my high school girlfriend sitting right there, Liz Cox, one of the Cox girls, arguably the pick of the litter. But Bob Triffett, my dear friend from First Street, now lives in our old house, 1018 Second, which is now 1018 Sonnet. I don't know why they did that. They changed the name of the street. But the first girl I ever danced with Liz Robbins, president, right here. Yeah, I'd never danced with a girl in my life. We were at the YWCA in the old days. They used to have dances over there. And Liz walked up to me. It was all the boys on one side and all the girls on the other side. Liz walked up and said, "Hugh, do you twist?" And it was Chubby Checker in the twist. I had no earthly idea what I was doing. And then again, where's Jim? Jim's in the back. Jim Lure, only girl in the room that I know of that I kissed in high school. That's her. She chased me, but my dear friend for many years. Bill Barnes, I think, is going to be here if he can. Mountain Harbor is where I always stayed. Bill and I were friends. He actually dated my sister Nancy for a time, who also dated Q. Byram Hearst and Ted Orwell and a litany of people. But it's great to be here. It's great to be here on Memorial Day. You know, I was, just as Liz was coming in today, I was out here on the telephone. One of my dear friends, one of the Cobra pilots that you'll see a reference to in my production, John Loftus, was killed yesterday in an RV. Years of service, 30 years in the Army, 15 years with United Airlines. He was out with his wife on an RV tour, slipped in the bathroom, fell, broke his neck. And so now we're all rushing around trying to figure out how to get the remains cremated and into Arlington, which is where he wants to go. That takes time to do that. But that's what Memorial Day is to us, to remember the guys that have gone before. In the group pictures I'm going to show you today, of the guys that started with me in January of '69, there were 10 of us, 10 pilots in my platoon. I'll show you the organization in a minute. But of those 10 guys, 2 of us were still alive in December, myself and Lieutenant Rod Willis. For those of you who know the book, Rod is in the Missouri Veterans Home now in the Alzheimer's unit. That's a terrible thing. I see him several times a month, but that's the way the ball bounces. But it's great to be here. Steve Skillard, where are you? Steve Skillard in the back, class of '67, became an Army aviator. I have no idea how that happened. He was not smart enough or pretty enough. But he wound up in Germany one day. I ran into him. He was just reassigned, and I got him over in the higher unit, and he was able to serve with me for several years in Germany. Rob Purdy, where's Rob? Rob is a Hot Springs boy. Did his service in the military and now flies your air ambulance out of the airport. And I said, I really want you to come. And he said, I'm going to try my best. He said, they just changed the contract, so they may fire me, but I don't care. He's wearing his flight suit, so if he jumps up and runs off, they've had a problem somewhere. But Tommy Maddox, Tommy was a longtime friend. Tommy was with me the only fight I ever got into in high school, and it was over Liz Cox's sister. And I'm not gonna name names, but the guy I got in a fight with was named Steve Baldwin. A doctor who was over at the Cox house where he shouldn't have been. And he invited me to the end of the street down by Jones School, and I went, and I hit him one time, and he went down, and I went, oh my God, what have I done? And then I let Steve Baldwin back up. That was not good. So Tommy was my second in that.
That's my only claim to fame.
That's it. That what was it? Harding College for you. Well, let me get on this thing. This is a program that I do in modified form around the Army and around the world today, and this is where I started. I joined the Army February 1st, 1967 as an enlisted paratrooper, and was very, very fortunate in basic training to shoot the high score in the brigade for rifle qualification. And that caused my company commander to take a look. Otherwise, I was just another guy. And he got to looking at me and he said, "You need to go to officer candidate school." I didn't even know what that was. And so I called my dad, who was a OCS graduate during World War II. And he said, "Of course you need to do that. And if you don't do that, I'm coming to Fort Polk, Louisiana, and I'm going to help you do that." And so I went off to officer candidate school at Fort Knox in the Armor Corps. And while I was there, in the last few weeks I was there, I noticed a thing on the bulletin board that said, "If you're interested in aviation, go see this guy." And so I did. And one of the requirements was to take an orientation flight in an Army helicopter. So I went down to Godman Field there at Fort Knox and took an orientation ride in the brand new OH-6 Cayuse, which was the newest aircraft in the inventory. You'll see them in a minute. And I was just taken aback by this little aircraft and what it would do. And so I went off to flight school. This was my first 6 months. This is Fort Walters, Texas. That's what I learned to fly in. That's the Hiller H-23D. And that's Fort Walters in the background there. In the morning, that complete square was completely full of helicopters, hundreds of them. And we would go out as new student pilots. They wouldn't let us hover. We ground taxied. You get the aircraft light on the skid and ground taxi to a takeoff point. And then they had white telephone poles that went out over those mountains in several corridors, and you would fly the telephone poles out. And then when you came back, you'd pick up the end telephone pole and follow it back in. So that's Fort Walters, Texas. It used to be Camp Walters in World War II, but it became the Army's primary helicopter school. I then went to Fort Rucker. That's the only picture I've got of me and a Huey. You guys should appreciate that. We flew UH-1D models in flight school and B models. I flew the gunship track, which was B model, and C model Hueys. All the C models were Vietnam, so we flew Bs and Ds. And then in January of 1969, I was assigned to Vietnam. I got there on the 1st of January, and I wanted to go to the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment. Steve Smith, where are you? You're back there. Steve Smith actually served in the 11th ACR. He also was not pretty enough or smart enough to be a pilot. He was a tanker. But I wanted to go to the 11th ACR, and the first day the assignments came out on the board, my name wasn't there, and the guys left to the 11th. And then I wanted to go to the 1st Cav Division, and it came out, and I wasn't on there, and the guys left to go to the 1st. And the third day, my name popped up on a list to go to the 1st Infantry Division. And I said, "Oh my God, how can I? I'm a young armor lieutenant. I need to be in the cavalry." And they said, "No, you're going to the 1st Infantry Division," arguably the oldest division in the Army. And so when I got there, the young orderly came and said, "Your ride to the 1st Division is here." And I went outside, and it was a dump truck, and the dump truck was full of dirty laundry, and there were two of us, Lieutenant John Fields and myself, piled in the back of this dump truck, and they took us up the road to the 1st Infantry Division. I said, "This is gonna be bad. If this is VIP transportation, I'm in big trouble." But as luck would have it, at the 1st Aviation Battalion, John, an infantry officer, went to 1st Av Battalion, and Hugh, a cavalry officer, was sent across the runway to D Troop, 1st Squadron, 4th Cavalry, which was part of the 1st Division's Armored Cavalry Squadron. The Armor Squadron of the day had 3 armor troops. These were tanks and personnel carriers, and 1 little air cav troop. And that air cav troop is where I wound up. In an air cavalry squadron, they had 3 air cav troops and 1 ground troop. It depended on what division you were in. The heavy divisions had armored cavalry squadrons. The light divisions had air cavalry squadrons. This was the air cavalry troop of the H series TOD from 1969, commanded by a major, 32 aircraft. Today, 32 aircraft is a brigade. This was a troop in 69, commanded by a major. We had 10 commissioned officers, 38 warrant officers, 130 enlisted men. And those 4 platoons were the platoons that made up the combat assets of the air cavalry troop. First platoon was the scout platoon. That was the platoon that I would ultimately command after the first 2 months. I may have to go a long time today because it's raining like hell and you guys don't want to walk in there. 10,086 aircraft, 2 officers, a platoon leader and a section leader, and then 12 enlisted and 10 warrant officers. The Aero Lift platoon, the second platoon, had Hueys, door gunners that were part of theirs, and then the Aero Weapons platoon, the third platoon, was the Cobra gunships. The unique factor of the air cavalry troop was not those helicopters, it was that fourth platoon. That fourth platoon was the only aviation unit in the United States Army that had its own organic infantry. 28 airborne rangers assigned to the air cav troop, carried into battle by that lift platoon, the second platoon, covered when they were on the ground by the Cobras and the Scouts. So the thing that made the air cav troop so unique was the fact that we were the only unit in the United States Army that was aviation with infantry organic to us. They lived with us. They flew with us every day, and you'll see more about them as we go along. Reconnaissance and security is the classic mission of the cavalry. Reconnaissance, security, and economy of force. The eyes and ears of the division were the cavalry squadron and the air cav troops specifically. Armed attack and hunter-killer teams, we'll talk about that in just a little bit. The Cobras were the armed attack, and when you combined the Cobras and the Scouts together, we were called hunter-killer teams. The Scouts were the hunters, the Cobras were the killers. Down-air crew recovery and tactical emergencies. One of our primary missions was if a aircraft went down in the 1st Infantry Division's AO, they would scramble our troop. We had hunter-killer teams on standby anytime it was light. And we'd scramble out and put a cap on top of the downed aviator, and then they'd desert those infantry guys to rescue them and bring them home. And I believe 128 guys we rescued in 1969 in the 3-Corps tactical zone. Ground reconnaissance was done by those arrow rifles, those infantry guys. We could put them on the ground. They could talk to the locals because integrated in that platoon were 4 Kit Carson scouts who were former enemy soldiers that had come back to the government's control under a program called the Chu Hoi, or Open Arms program. They were former enemy troops that had fought the Americans. They changed sides and became Kit Carson scouts. And then we had one Arvin, Army of the Republic of Vietnam, staff sergeant who was their interpreter. Eagle flights, LRPs, or long-range reconnaissance patrol, observation posts, and listening posts at night. Those were the typical roles and missions that we had. In terms of enemy troops, when I was there in '69, the principal foe for us was North Vietnamese regulars. The Viet Cong, which were the insurgents, had long been beaten into submission, and now we were fighting main force North Vietnamese regulars. These were guys that were as equipped as we were, as well equipped, hardcore. I'll show you some of them later that I got to meet later on in my career. Viet Cong guerrillas, largely light infantry sappers. A sapper is a guy that slips into your perimeter at night and blows up your buildings and your helicopters. The engineer program in the Army now calls themselves sappers after these guys. But largely they were in 3-Corps, where I was on my first tour. They were largely light infantry. The typical weapons that we were concerned about in the aircraft was the 50 caliber machine gun or 51, the 30 caliber, the rocket propelled grenade in 3-Corps. And then on my second tour, 85 millimeter twin radar directed guns. This was up on the DMZ. And then of course, in the April conflict of 1972, they introduced a little thing called the Strela, which was a man-packed portable anti-aircraft missile. Looked like a bazooka, but it shot a rocket and it homed in on the exhaust of the aircraft. I'll talk more later. In 3 Corps, we flew about 1,500 feet with the guns and the Hueys, which put us really out of effective range for the AK-47. You'd have to be over 5,000 feet to be out of range for the 51 cal. And the Scouts, my outfit, flew at an average, you'll see some of it in a bit, about 46 feet over the highest terrain feature. So we were not as high as the ceiling of this room. But we could, from that position, we could track, we could follow footprints, we could smell the enemy, we could see them face to face. You'll see it in a minute. In the high threat environments, the 85th, 85 millimeter, and the Strela, everybody went low. How low could you go? This was our area of operations. This is in low-level hell in the book. This is the map that's at the beginning. This was the 1st Infantry Division's operational area. Cambodia, the Fishhook, and the Angel's Wing up there in the north. And then Saigon is down at the very bottom, and we had everything in the middle. You've probably heard of a place called the Iron Triangle. And if you haven't heard of that, I know you've heard of the product named Michelin. That right in the middle to the left side, where all those little dots are, is the Michelin rubber plantation. That is where the French government extracted rubber from Michelin tires and still does to this day. While we were there in '69, early on, we were not allowed to fly into the Michelin because of the political repercussions of blowing up French rubber trees. In March of 1969, that changed, and the 1st Division invaded the Michelin rubber on the 1st of March at 0600 in the morning. And I had the great honor to be the first scout into the Michelin with a young warrant officer named Bill Jones. He was training me. I was not yet the platoon leader. And I have never seen so many North Vietnamese soldiers in my life who didn't expect us to come and had free range to wander around the Michelin. But that operation took about a month. And it was called Atlas Wedge, was the name of that particular mission. But the Infantry Division's headquarters at Lai Khe, almost right there in the middle. And then these are the terrain features that you see if you read the book, the Coliseum, the Onion Stem, the T10 River, all of those things were the places that we flew every day. We flew it so often, we really didn't even use maps. The Cobras did to record grid coordinates, but the scout pilots just went by sight. These are typical. Would you kill those lights maybe on this end, Paul? Where are you? Oh, you're right.
She's got it.
This is back here. These are the typical weapons. In the chapter of the book called Hot Dogging It, I was flying along one morning at 7 o'clock in the morning, right on the trees, and I popped over a Nippapalm line, and spread out in front of me were 28 enemy soldiers, and big fight. These are the weapons that they had with them that we collected that day: RPGs, AK-47s, Chinese radios, and so on. And this little baby here, that's an RPD 30 caliber machine gun on an anti-aircraft mount. They drug it through the jungle on those wheels. And then when they got ready to shoot it, you stand it up on the end and you shoot it. There's a mortar. That's me standing there. That's my feet standing there by the mortar tube. Good picture of me, Steve Smith would say that. The book starts in a chapter called Thunder Road. This was Highway 13. Every morning between Lai Khe and Loc Ninh and Quan Loy, the Army would go out and sweep that highway for mines. You didn't find them all. This truck had just been hit, had just run over a mine. If you look up to the road and to the left, that black spot is the crater from a what would later be called an improvised explosive device. But that's a gasoline tanker that's going to burn for a little bit. There's that crater from another view. This area on both sides of Highway 13 had been roam plowed or bulldozed less than a month before. That's how fast the jungle came back in Vietnam. And these guys would actually walk up and down the road with mine detectors. At the very bottom left of the picture is the muzzle of my door gunner's M60 machine gun. So this is about the altitude that we flew on the high side. Now, this picture is not for gratuitous purposes, but it is to show you, these are 3 dead NVA soldiers. My door gunner, that's his gun on the right side there, has just dispatched these 3 guys. The area had already been cleared that morning, and yet they were dug into spider holes, no bigger around than their shoulders, and they buried themselves so that when the truck came by, they'd pop up with an RPG. And that just shows you how clever and adaptive they were in conditions where they had no chance to survive once they showed themselves. This is a North Vietnamese soldier the way they were normally equipped. They wore a green shirt, green pants, sandals called VC sandals, and underneath him was an RPG-7. And he had been dug in those bushes just before we nailed him. But that's the altitude that we flew, and that's the only reason I show that. These are the Scouts. That's the 086 Cayuse made by Hughes Helicopters. Howard Hughes started Hughes Helicopters. And in 1965-66, the Army did a fly-off for the next light observation helicopter. Bell, Hiller, and Hughes produced the OH-4, OH-5, and OH-6. The OH-6 was the product winner, having set 23 world records during the validation process. This is the first aircraft I ever flew in that I didn't jump out of. But this shows you a good arrangement. The pilot in the front, the door gunner in the back. The door gunner's got a thing in his hand we call bombs. I'm going to show you some of that in a bit. The old military pilots are going to have a hissy fit when they see that. But this is the view from the ground of an OH-6. I took this picture while I was on the ground with our rifle guys. Every once in a while when we had days off, I'd go out on the ground with the rifle guys because I like to see what the ground was like, what the bunkers were like, the things I was reporting from the air, I wanted to see from the ground. And I took that picture. But that's the vantage point that the average enemy soldier would have toward us. One of my crew chiefs pointing out the bullet hole that went right through the back of the aircraft where he was sitting. But that shows you basically how the crew chief flew. Interesting, the 086 was a relatively small aircraft, very fast, very maneuverable, but not real big. And all of my crew chiefs who sat in the back were little guys. You couldn't put a 6-foot guy back there with any comfort. And most of them flew about like that, sideways on the seat, hanging out of the aircraft with the M60 machine gun. This is how we rearmed and refueled ourselves in Vietnam. Every base that we went to was not always occupied. This is an ARVN FARP, forward area refueling and rearming position. You would land there, crank open the generator, put the gas port in the airplane and fill yourself up. Crew chiefs would do that normally while we were running. We would stay hot. The aircraft would remain running while the crew chief filled you up. And then we would turn right around and go to the other side, and that's where they had rockets, ammunition, smoke grenades, hand grenades, and all that sort of thing. So this was a self-service fuel station. For those of you who've been to Vietnam, that's Nua Ba Dinh in the very back over the top of that Huey rotor blade. That's the Black Virgin Mountain, 25th Infantry Division area. This is one of my favorite pictures. I was getting ready to go out on the ground with the ARCs. And my roommate, my buddy for 2 of my 3 Vietnam tours, was a guy named Rod Willis. And when you wore a chicken plate, which is that tungsten carbide body armor that we wore, the carrier of it after a few days would smell like the north end of a southbound mule. Guys that have been in law enforcement, it's like when you take your vest off. That's what it smelled like. So we would take the carrier off and wash it, and that was the tungsten carbide core. And Rod thought it would be funny to just take his grease pencil and draw a bullseye in the middle of my chicken plate. 2 days later, wearing that chicken plate, I got hit in the chest armor twice. You can see those 2 black serrations. One of them is dead center in that bullseye. And so now, even though he's in the Alzheimer's ward of the Missouri Veterans Home, every time I go in there, I say, "You son of a bitch, you wrote that on my body." And he still remembers it. This is a typical look at a scout with our armament system. The armament system on the OH-6 was called an XM27E1. It was a 6-barrel Gatling gun, electric driven. We carried 1,500 rounds in that box, and it fired at 2,000 and 4,000 shots a minute, very fast. And that was mounted on the left side of the aircraft. And then in this particular configuration, there's an observer in the front left seat, pilot in the right. That's how we flew in the Delta. In '69, we flew with pilot in the front, door gunner in the back rear. But again, this is a good shot of the normal engagement altitude that we flew at. You have to be careful here. You fly over a water buffalo with a 14-year-old kid on it, the buffalo will take off and the kid goes with it without much hope of getting off. One of the major tributaries, traffic tributaries were the rivers and streams in Vietnam. Every morning at first light and last light on my third tour down in the Delta, we would patrol these riverways and look at the sampans that were going up and down. You would think it's hard to determine who's a good guy and who's a bad guy. What do you think here? Good guy or bad guy?
I hope it's bad, guy.
How could you tell? One principal way you can tell. He is a bad guy. That is a North Vietnamese soldier. If the enemy troops would not look at you, they were bad guys. Friendly guys would look at you, they'd wave at you. Not a lot of concern, but the enemy, once you got within eye-to-eye contact, they would not look at you. This guy was a North Vietnamese soldier with weapons and explosives underneath that. We put a couple of holes in his sampan and he paddled over to shore to keep from sinking. And that's what we found. This is June of '69. This was Purple Heart #1. The beautiful thing about the OH-6, it was built around a truss A-frame. And if you crashed it, it would shed the tail gear, the tail rotor, the tail boom, the rotor blades, and the skids. It would roll itself up in a ball, but they did not burn. I only saw one OH-6 burn in 3 years of combat, and that's a guy that landed on a stump and it punctured the fuel cell. But normally that's what they look like after they crash. God agrees. This is the front end of the aircraft. The round came in between my rotor pedals and it hit the body armor on my right side and went through my right buttock, ricocheted inside the armor plate through my left buttock and left the aircraft in the left side. And that looks a lot worse than it was. But that's me crawling out. I crawled out on the left side once we rolled up on the ball. And that's what it looked like when we got it back. Normally the scouts flew into combat on the wing of the Cobra. That's a Cobra with me on the echelon left wing. Like I said, we were single pilot. Cobras were dual pilot. So it was very difficult for us to manipulate a map. We didn't have navigation gear to speak of. And so we flew on the wing of the Cobra until he gave us a grid designation, a point on the ground where perhaps two rivers came together, and he'd say, okay, go down to the river junction and then take up a heading of 270. And at the end of the box, we were supposed to reconnoiter. He'd say, limit, and I'd turn right, go 50 yards, and then start back the other way, 090. But that's the way we worked. I loved the cavalry so much, I painted cross sabers on the front of my helicopter, those yellow cross sabers. And the crew chiefs hated doing that because it was a lot of work doing that. Here's my aircraft again. I'm leaving Like on a scramble mission. Jimmy Parker, for those of you who read the book, that's Jimmy in the back seat. He was my principal crew chief. He made it. He's in Calhoun, Georgia. I see him. I'm going to see him in August in Albuquerque. But when we scrambled. That Chinook is being told to hold position. He's on approach. And he was told to hold, and I just was scrambling out of IK on a mission. But that basically shows you the armor plate was not all that effective, because as you fly the aircraft, you can see how much of the body is really exposed. That's the only armor plate on the aircraft. The engine had a small box over the fuel control that was tungsten carbide, but that's the armor that we had, and it didn't really protect you all that much. Now, when you go to all the trouble to paint the sabers on the front of your helicopter, it makes the crew chief really mad when you run into trees. One of the dangers of flying the altitude we flew was dead trees. We're flying in right-hand circles. I'm looking out the right door when I'm doing the scout mission. I'm not really looking ahead. And a dead tree sticking up like a big claw would sometimes sneak up on us. And this is one where I flew through a dead tree. And of course, they had to replace the bubble. That's all that was really hurt. And then they had to paint my sabers back on there for me. This is Mike King. This is tour number 3, my second tour in the Scouts. And Jimmy Christie is the crew chief there, taking off out of the Delta. But you can see they got a little brighter with the markings. This is 1972, about May, June 72, coming out of Canto. Probably my favorite picture of all. I was flying in the Delta on tour 3, and an enemy gun opened up on me on that little peninsula over there. And I turned toward it and hit the minigun. That's the minigun going off that you see. And one of the enemy bullets penetrated a white phosphorus grenade, which was in my back seat with my crew chief. And that grenade, when it's penetrated, not exploded, but when the casing is penetrated, contact with oxygen causes the white phosphorus to ignite. And that's what's going on. That picture was taken from my Cobra. And moments after that, I turned it 90 degrees to get it to blow out the side. The crew chief was really pissed that day about that. He was back there with it when it went on. This is the typical, I put this on here to just show, this is what helicopter pilots wore in the 60s and 70s. That's a Nomex flight suit, Nomex flight gloves. They were flame retardant, not flame proof. You can see the little red device there is a fire extinguisher. The SPH-4 sound attenuating helmet, that's the chicken plate with its carrier. And then the pistol is worn in an optimistic fashion to protect certain parts of the body. I can tell you, if a bullet ever hit that, you would come away a high tenor. But this particular aircraft picture is interesting. If you look that's Tim Colberg. We lost Tim Colberg 2 months ago. But just to the left of Tim, right under the A in U.S. Army, you see an exhaust pipe that sticks up. That was brand new in July of 1972 as a result of the introduction of the Strela missile. That was a heat diffusing device that was put onto the OH-6 to cause the rotor or the engine heat to go up into the rotor blade rather than straight back. Without that device, an enemy missile would come right up your tailpipe. With that device, it would hopefully explode above the aircraft and not in the aircraft, causing a catastrophic damage. But that was the first heat diffusers in Army aircraft right there. This is 69. That's that little tributary that goes off to the left there. I was coming up the river. That's me in the OH-6. I was coming up the river and I saw a trail of smoke coming up ahead of me, and it was actually about 15 or 20 North Vietnamese soldiers cooking breakfast. And we were at first light. And as I came over the top of them and turned, that's when I saw that it was bad guys cooking. And they had just come ashore from a 30-foot sampan that was parked in that little tributary. And the sampan had a 50 on the front deck of it. So we shot that up, the Cobra shot it up. That smoke there is coming from the Cobra having just shot the sampan up, and that's me just south coming back in. And I was scouting that area right there as a landing zone for the ARCs, to put the ARCs on the ground to investigate the sampan. And I don't know how well you can see it, but Right at the lower edge of that tree line, those are the ARPs having been inserted. You can see their helmets. But that's how well the guys blended into the jungle. Our ARPs wore camouflage rather than the green typical Army jungle fatigue. They wore the camouflage. And that's me hovering over the top of them. My mission when the ARPs were on the ground was to protect them. Don't let them get ambushed. Don't let somebody pop a trap on them. And you'll see in a minute why that was important. These are quarter-pound sticks of C4 explosive wrapped around a concussion grenade and then wrapped with ammunition. These were homemade bombs. In the Delta, we found that the Cobra's rockets would penetrate the mud before they exploded, and they were not as effective in the Mekong Delta as they were up in the hard ground of 3 Corps and I Corps. So the crew chiefs decided to make these bombs, and we would land on top of enemy structures, pop the pin and throw these on the inside and then take off again. You had to be pretty quick because it annoyed the people in the bunkers when you did that. But this is the back seat of an 086, and we would normally carry 6 to 8 bombs in the back, along with the M60 machine gun you see there. You see the warrant officer headgear, that's their idea. Warrant officers think of stuff like that. But that was the working department of the crew chief in those days. Another really interesting picture in 2 or 3, we were down in the Delta, and the North Vietnamese came out of Cambodia one night, and they hit an ARVN unit at a place called the Concrete Plant at Rock Jaw. And I was sent in the next morning to track those guys back into Cambodia and try to deal with them. And in doing so, I was following a trail further out in the rice paddy there, and I could see the footprints of about 15 or 20 guys. And I came upon a smoking cigarette butt. And I told my door gunner that day, he was not a normal door gunner, I'll tell you about him. But I told my gunner that day, we're gonna have enemy troops, they're gonna be close, because that cigarette butt's still smoking. They didn't go very far. And I looked over to the right and I said, you see those big trees? They're gonna be right at the base of the big trees. When I come to a stop, straight down, I want you to open up because you're gonna have enemy troops there. That's me hovering over the area right now. We did that. The smoke comes from the Cobras having shot after we did, and then I rolled out. But my door gunner that day was another officer. And our troop administration officer was named Jim Adamson. Jim was a West Point graduate who came to Vietnam late in his career, having taught physics at West Point. And he wanted so badly to get into the fight that he would come out and fly with the scouts, something very few people would do. And I took him out one day. I said, I'll take you out and get you in a fight. Quit bothering me about going with me. I'll take you out and get you in a fight. And we did that day, the very first day. That is Jim Adamson, who was Dark Horse One, good looking guy, West Point, a very senior captain, who went on to greater fame as a pilot of the space shuttle. Jim Adamson was Army astronaut number 3. Today, there have been a bunch of them from the Army that flew as mission specialists and pilots for the space shuttle. But Jim, a former physics professor from West Point, wound up as Army astronaut number 3. Bobby Hudson was number 1, Woody Spring was number 2, and Jim was number 3. How many people have read Low Level Hell? And that's Joe Vad. Joe Vad is the guy who designed our Low Level Hell patch. Up until July of '69, we wore a blue patch with a white skull on it that just said Outcasts, the name of the platoon. Joe didn't like that, so he designed the red Low Level Hell patch with the skull and cross sabers. Former Marine, he had done a previous tour of Vietnam as a Marine infantryman, and he was one of my warrant officer scout pilots. That's Chico sitting on his shoulder. Chico was Joe Vad's monkey. The building on your left was the captain's hooch. All the lowly people, like the warrant officers and the first lieutenants, myself, lived together. The captains, there were only about 6 of them, lived in one hooch and they had hot running water. We didn't. Jovad taught Chico to climb up on that water container and open the top and poop and pee in the cafeteria. The guy on the right is named John Balthazar, and Balthazar told Joe one day, he said, I can't believe you do that. And Joe said, well, come here, I'll show you. And he actually did, and I took that picture. Once the captains figured out what Chico had been doing, Chico disappeared. I have no idea where Chico went. On the 6th of November of 1969, Jovad was on a scouting mission with a crew chief named Jim Downing. And he saw an enemy soldier who came out of a tree line, and he turned to engage him. The enemy soldier ran, fired a rifle over his shoulder, and hit Jovad in the forehead. Killed him instantly. The aircraft rolled inverted. That is the only aircraft I've ever seen, 086 I've ever seen explode when it hit, and we lost Downing and Vad that day. Years later, after Low Level Hell was published in '92, I was sitting at home and the phone rang, and I picked it up, and this little timid female voice said, "You don't know me, but my name is Lisa Vad." I said, "Yeah, I know you. You're Joe Vad's daughter. She was an infant when he was killed." She was a flight attendant for Air Nova out of Halifax, Nova Scotia. She came down to Missouri, met with my wife and I. We went up to North Missouri to the parents of Downing, who Joe was killed with, and visited Downing's grave. Joe's buried in the Bronx in New York. He's from New York and a native of Puerto Rico. Here are the Cobras. This is an early 1968 Cobra G model, the first model of the Cobra gunship, designed specifically as a gunship. This was our partner aircraft. For the pilots in the room, that's a TAP 101 turret with a single minigun, a blue Perspex canopy. They thought blue would be good because of the sunlight in Vietnam. It was terrible for night flight. And so ultimately the Cobra canopies were all changed to clear. These aircraft came with a single XM-18 pod on either side, minigun pod, and then those are 19-shot rocket pods. Aircraft commander pilot sat in the back, co-pilot gunner sat in the front and operated the turret. The landing light in those days was in the nose, and that clear nose cap. The newer ones went under the belly. Changed that. Bob Davis, unfortunately, has the worst call sign of any of my scout pilots. Bob was flying one day in the area of the 11th Armored Cav Regiment when it was commanded by Colonel George Patton, the son of the World War II Patton. And Bob was down there in the middle of a fight, and Patton was trying to get his Cobras in, and he said on the radio, "Get that F bubble." I'll let you guys fill that in. "Get that F bubble out of the way." So Bob's call sign to this day, I talked to him last night, to this day is Fox Bravo 13, which stands for F bubble. And he lives up in Alaska. But that's the markings that we would put on our aircraft in 1969. The shark's teeth were unique to my unit. Typical Cobra from the side. From the front, 36 inches at the waist, 42 inches at the canopy, very narrow, designed from the ground up as a gunship. This one has two 19-shot pods inboard and 7-shot pods outboard. In 70, they added the 20-millimeter Vulcan cannon to the Cobra, which, in my opinion, the finest weapon system we had. You could duke it out with a 51 with one of these. And those are proximity fused rockets. Those white tipped rockets are proximity fused. They would go off above ground. The 20 ship was a tremendous aircraft. You had to add, you can see the partitions on the left side of the aircraft there. They had to put armor plating on the side of the airplane because the muzzle blast of the 20-millimeter Vulcan, it was a rotary cannon, it was derated to 950 shots a minute because at 4,000 shots a minute, it would flip the aircraft upside down. But initially, when we first got to 20 millimeter, they would fire it. The SCAS system, the stability control augmentation system, would kick offline. The intervalometers would cycle. It would fire rockets and the left door would open. In flight in a dive. And we all said, that's not cool. So they put armor plating on the, actually fiberglass plating for additional armor on the left side against the muzzle blast. Again, this is a shot from my loads flying in the Delta with my Cobra. Usually when we went from point A to B, we flew at altitude, 1,500 feet. Looking back, that's Arbitrator, one of our Cobras. On the 30th of January, on my second tour, I flew Cobras on my second tour. On that particular day, I had a catastrophic emergency in my rocket system. It exploded in the middle of an attack run. My right wing exploded, blew the tail off the aircraft, and we augered into the side of a mountain. And this is a great shot of me getting hoisted into an HH-53 Jolly Green Giant from the 37th Air Evacuation Squadron, the Jolly Green Air Rescue guys. Down at the Cobra's cockpit, if you can make that out, just above the broken canopy, is Staff Sergeant Harvey J. Picklesheimer, an unfortunate name for a great pararescueman. But he's the guy that cut my co-pilot out of the front seat and then put me in the Stokes litter there, and I'm coming up. I got a busted leg, but I got my KY-28 with me underneath my left arm. Most people can't figure that out, but there's a little square box that had our encrypted system, our security control, our cipher system in the aircraft. And I didn't want to leave that because it was classified. So I made him take that out of the airplane. I got it under my arm. I tried to help him several times when he was cutting John Bryant out of the front. He'd say, "Captain, sit down." And I'd sit down, then I'd get up again and try to help him. And he'd say, "Captain, sit down." And finally, he put me down. And I was going to shoot my KY-28. I got my 45 out. I'm going to shoot a hole in it. And he said, "My God, put that thing away." I would have blown us up. The fuel was everywhere. And he said, "Hang on." And he used the Zeus fastener tool and got the device out and gave it to me. And so I wound up in the hospital in Da Nang, 85th Evac Hospital. And the next, are there any nurses in the room? Anybody in here a nurse or a doctor? I wound up in the 85th Evac Hospital in a bed with an IV. And when I woke up, I had to go to the bathroom, not in a good way. And so I rang my little buzzer and the nurse came and I said, "I got to go to the bathroom." And she brought me a bedpan. And I said, "I ain't going in a bedpan." And she said, "Well, suit yourself." And I looked over at my little IV stand, which looked like that. I just got it and rolled it into the men's room, and I got to the toilet area, and there was a bar across the top of the toilet area, and the little roller wouldn't go through there. So I just took the IV bottle off, put it on the floor. Did what I had to do, got back, put it back on the stand, went back and got in my bed. I was very proud of myself. And then after the blood backed up in my IV, I had to push my little button again. She was not happy. The nurses were watching Gunsmoke when I was trying to do all that. They didn't want to. But I will say this, God bless the nurses. They did wonderful work. We lost 8 of them in the conflict. 8 nurses were killed. 1 by enemy action, the others were all by accident, aircraft crash and so on. That's my aircraft taken from the Jolly Green. That's the side of it. I would go back to this site in 2015. I went with a film crew to Vietnam, and we went back to meet 17 members of the former 241st Anti-Aircraft Regiment of the North Vietnamese Army. And we spent 3 weeks with those guys. And one of the places I wanted to go was to 802's resting place. It was on the top of a mountain. And I went with a little Vietnamese guy named Mr. B, who was missing his arm from the elbow down on the left side. he lost his arm because he was a scavenger after the war. He would scavenge salvage and surplus and all that, and he got a piece of live ordnance and blew his arm off. But he knew exactly where my aircraft was, and we actually climbed to the top of that mountain. It had been bombed a day or two later to avoid the gun system being captured. And so it was in a lot of pieces, what was left of it. There wasn't much. But I did bring one piece back with me. I've got it at home. It's the largest piece of 802, which I rode into that mountain. I've got it home. That's a Cobra again. Minigun there on the nose. Ammo bay for the 20 millimeter behind there. Bob Davis here. Bob is in a lot of pictures, and he wasn't a Cobra pilot. He was a scout pilot. He'd like to stand in front of the Cobras and get his picture taken. We could land anywhere. We were on an operation here in the Delta with ARVN soldiers in the background in 72. And when we needed to land, we would just land where we needed to land. That's the beauty of a helicopter. Towers Tiger, that's another one. Typical, that's an old Marine Corps revetment for a Marine Corps fixed wing. And when we moved into the unit, that's where we parked our Cobras. Cobra breaking off for a gun run. That's the back seat of the Cobra. Same gun sight that's in an F4U Corsair from Korea. But that's the Cobra pilot's back seat. Every morning, the slicks would line up on the runway, and the ARPs, those are the ARPs putting their gear in the slicks so that they were ready for a takeoff. To keep the dust down, they poured petroleum products called Pentaprime, which unknown to us at the time were loaded with all kinds of cancer-inducing components. But every time you'd come in from the flight line, if it was really hot, your boots were completely corked with that stuff, and you'd have to clean your boots off. But that's how those slips would line up every day. The platoon for the ARPs was commanded by an O2, a first lieutenant, platoon sergeant, 4 heavy gun squads. It's unusual for an infantry squad in a platoon to have 4 machine guns. These guys didn't spend the night on the ground. They always came home with us. So all they carried into combat was food, water, and ammunition. And they carried a lot of it. A PRC-77 is a radio. Each squad had its own radio, its own squad leader. Ammo was the primary. All the guys that came to the ARPs were initially somewhere else in the 1st Division for their first 6 months. We only took guys that were very veteran infantry guys. We had an ARVN interpreter, and then we had the 4 Chuhois. You'll see them here in a minute. They were Kit Carson scouts, former NBA. We also would occasionally get national policemen. They wore a white helmet. We call them the white mice. They would go out and check documents and so on, protected by the ARPs, and then we determine who was good guys and who was bad guys. TRAP is tactical recovery of air crews and personnel. 47 Army pilots were rescued by us in '69. When the slicks flew into combat, they flew in a echelon left formation. Platoon leader of the slicks and the platoon leader of the ARPs in the same aircraft. That first one on the right. The guys sat on the floor. They didn't have seats in the aircraft. They just sat on the floor. Again, echelon left at about 1,500 feet. When they got ready to go into an LZ, they would go into a trail formation. And the last guy would say, lead, you've got to flight up trail and then into the landing zone. Once they're on the ground, this is what an infantry officer or infantry soldier saw in 3 Corps in '69. That's how thick the jungle was in the 1st Division area. So one of the jobs you didn't want was point man in those days. That's the guy in the front. Because of that, our primary mission was to fly over the top of them and guide them and keep them from getting into trouble that we could spot from directly above. We would put a red smoke grenade on their objective. They could see the smoke grenade, but you could see That elephant grass, that's actually the platoon sergeant of the Arcs right there, and he was 6'4". Look how tall he is, and look at the grass they had to walk through. That's Sergeant Gwynn, that's the platoon sergeant behind him. Sergeant Gwynn was a staff sergeant in the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. He was an ethnic North Vietnamese. He had taught English in the university in Hanoi, had come south before the war, joined the ARVN Army, spoke fluent English and Vietnamese, and he was our interface between our Kit Carson scouts. When they started jabbering about something, they knew what they were talking about, and Sergeant Gwynn was the one that would tell us what they were saying. The only guy that we don't really know what happened to after the war was Gwynn. We don't think Gwynn got out. We think he was either killed or went into a re-education camp with the Vietnamese. But Gwynn is the one guy I've wondered about all these years. These are two of the Kit Carsons. That's Roy and Toy. They're both in the book. They were brothers. They had been former enemies. If they got concerned, you paid attention to them because they knew what they were doing. Both Roy and Toy were killed before December of '69. But these were the guys that were on the ground when I was there. This is the Arcs moving through the jungle toward an objective. That's one of our scouts flying over the top. Well, we can see directly down. We can see far better than they could. Again, we're having them approach. If you've read the book, the guy on the far right that's pointing is Stu Harrell. Stu was the platoon leader the second half of '69. He came to us from the 82nd Airborne Division. Stu made it through the war. Stu lives in Phoenix, Arizona, where he is. This is an airborne ranger with 2 tours in Vietnam, and he is a ballroom dance instructor in Phoenix. Do I love getting together with him every year? Every year I ask him to teach me a new dance step, and it irritates the hell out of him. That's Bob Harris, who was in also in the book, the platoon leader the first half of '69. Bob died of Parkinson's disease. He's buried in Arlington. Special guy here, that's Doc, the medic for our unit. Doc was an evangelical minister from rural Athens, Tennessee. If you've ever been to urban Athens, Tennessee, you can imagine what rural Athens is like. But Doc was a conscientious objector. He would not carry a weapon. We argued and argued and argued with him. And finally, somebody convinced him, you may have to protect your wounded. At least carry a pistol. So Doc carried a pistol, but I never saw him handle it or touch it in any way. And in the middle of a firefight one day, one of the guys out front was hit and went down. And I'm flying over the top trying to get on a shooting solution. And I look down and Doc gets up and starts walking toward the wounded, and he goes about 6 feet. Boom, flat on his face. I thought, oh, they killed Doc. Well, they didn't. He stepped on a root and tripped himself and fell. Broke his arm and got the Purple Heart. So he was under fire when he got wounded, and we argue with him as much as we do Stu about ballroom dancing. My pilot's in the room. You see anything unusual? This is the cockpit of a UH-1H on the final approach into a landing zone. The pilot on the left is Wayne McAdoo, the platoon leader. Anybody see anything that catches your attention? Come on, Huey pilot, that's a Huey.
That's a crew chief. I was in charge.
Well, then you knew more about it than the pilot did. Look at the dashboard. In those days, there was a company called W.C. Whitney, and they had a catalog for car parts. And this crew chief sent back to W.C. Whitney and got a wood dashboard modification kit, adopted it to the UH-1 Huey, and that is a wood panel dashboard and a UH-1 Huey in 1960. How many hours it must have taken him to cut those holes out for all those instruments. But that is the platoon commander's aircraft of the quarter cab, flown by Wayne McAdoo. And it was the only wooden dashboard in all of Vietnam. When the guys got ready to be picked up, they would park a smoke grenade, and the Hueys would come back in again and trail to get them. The arcs that were the passengers would fan out in a circle to protect the landing zone. And then each squad leader would hold up a identification panel, which they carried inside their helmet. And that's what the Huey would shoot to. I love that picture. That's a great shot. Couple of local things, because Liz asked me to do that. That's my dad and mother and me on the back steps of Bobby Triffitt's house. In the summer of 1966. I just graduated from Hot Springs High School, and I was headed off to Arkansas Tech, where I mastered the ROTC program and the Sport Parachute Club. Everything else was an abject failure. But Bob Triffitt's family bought that house after we left, and Bobby lives in it now, my dear neighbor from First Street. And are those steps still there, Bob?
Yes,
Did-
covered over with the porch.
That's built over where the porch, that's where Jim lived, on the back porch. They built a little room for my brother John and Jim when they were little in the old back porch. That's me in February of 67, when I enlisted in the Army. That's Fort Polk, Louisiana, February of 67. In December of 67, I graduated from Armor Officer Candidate School. That's me at OCS. 2 little ribbons, National Defense and good conduct. I don't know how I got to good conduct. My first picture in Vietnam, 1969, I initially flew Hueys for a month. And Wayne McAdoo, the platoon leader, is sitting on the bottom there. Bob Holmes with his hand on his hat. Was my roommate. This is the front of a Huey. This was the hooch I lived in at Fuloy. That's the typical. We had 8 or 10 of those. Concrete bottom, wood top, metal roof. Awful when it rained. It rained a lot in Vietnam, but it was so darn loud with the rain. And one of the threads of continuity in most of my pictures is every time you see me in the rear somewhere, I'm wearing my hat like that. I don't know why I did that. I just wore it on the back of my head. But that's Dean Shiner, if you've read the book. Dean was my Cobra pilot most of the time. Dean is the guy who, when I was shot down over Highway 13, Dean strafed to the enemy until he was out of ammo as they were coming to get us. And when he was out of ammo, he kept strafing empty until a Huey flying down the road happened to see him and cruised in. Holmes, me, and Dean Shiner. That's Dean again. This is June or July of 69. I'm now 21 years old. I just turned 21. And for validation, I grew the mustache. Look at that black hair. That went away a long time ago. This is December of 69. This is 6 months after that picture was taken. That is 142 hours of flight time a month for 12 months. 1,562 hours of single pilot time my first tour. The only time in my career I ever smoked, it was right there. Cigarettes came free in the sea rations. That's the only reason I did it. But for some reason, I always wore my hat like that. I don't know why I did that. This is December 1969. That's my mother, Don McCullough Mills, and that's arriving back at Drake Field in Fayetteville. And that's my welcome home kiss. Hardest thing in the world is to write home from Vietnam because you're very careful about what you say. My mother and father had no idea what I did for a living. They knew I flew helicopters. That's all they knew. They didn't know I was a scout pilot. They didn't know what a scout pilot was. This is welcome home in August of 1972. My mother again. And that's Brother Jim in the background there, clueless, right there in Fayetteville. Wants to know why we're at the airport. Well, it's your brother just came home. So, in 2015, I went back to Vietnam with a movie crew to film a documentary. And we had been arranged to meet with, I had asked a friend of mine, I said, we fought a 3-day heavy battle in December of 72. We lost 3 aircraft in 1 day. And then we went back on the 25th of January, we lost another aircraft. And then on 30 January was my picture where I went down. And I asked a friend of mine who worked for the CIA during the period, I said, can you determine who that unit was we fought on this day at this location? He said, let me check. And he got back to me a week later and he said, 7th Company, 10th Battalion, 241st NVA Anti-Aircraft Regiment. That was your opposing force. I said, how in the world did you know that? Merle Pibenow is his name. He's an author. I said, how in the world did you know that? He said, their unit history, I translated it for the CIA. And then he sent me all their unit history. So we arranged through some other folks to meet with these guys. These are 17 of the 41 original members of that unit. And I met with them in Hanoi, Vietnam one night in a cafe. And then we spent 3 weeks together. We went from the north to Ho Chi Minh's headquarters during World War II. He fought with us, by the way. Most people don't know that. Ho Chi Minh supported the OSS in recovering American pilots in Vietnam, which then was called Cochin, China. But I spent 3 weeks with these guys, and they all wore their uniforms, which I thought was very, very cool. And my communist minders who were with me the whole time we were there said I could not wear my uniform. And so it was very hot that day, and of course I had my uniform anyway and my cav hat. And the minders stayed in the bus because it was air conditioned. And I said, let's go take a group picture. And I reached into my bag and pulled out my uniform and put it on. And that's me with them on the exact location where Charlie Horse 25 was shot down, just east of Khe Sanh. Wonderful guys. The first question they wanted to know from me when we met the first night, they said, how old were you then? I said, I was 24. I was a captain on that tour, my second tour. I was 24. And I said, how old were you then? And they all said about 18. In the Vietnamese culture, the uncle is a revered position. And so they started calling me Uncle Hugh for 3 weeks, which when pronounced by a Vietnamese is uncomfortably like Uncle Ho, Ho Chi Minh. They treated my wife with absolute dignity. They called her Madame. And everywhere we went, if we were walking and someone came by with a motor scooter, they would stop, put her on the back, and she'd ride on the motor scooter, side saddle, and we would walk. But I went to a great trip. I really enjoyed it. We went to the grave of the guy that shot one of my people down, and I wanted to meet him, but he had since passed away, and we went to his grave and paid some respects there. But it was a great trip. They were wonderful guys, devilish little bastards. They all wanted to, everywhere we went, they wanted to do a rice wine toast with you, one at a time. 17 of them and one of me, and every time I turned around, one had come up with a little rice wine. And so I'd do 17 shots for theirs. By the end of most days, I was blasted. This is my last flying career. I was the commander of the aviation division for the Kansas City Police Department. That's Sharon in the background there. My wife was a vice detective with KC, and I was getting ready to take her out on a real mission to show her an area where they were going to put her in at night. We had a problem in Kansas City with a serial killer that was killing prostitutes. and they were putting her on the street as a decoy to try to get this guy to make a move on her. I volunteered her for that job. But I was getting ready to take her out on the mission to show her where we were gonna be in a couple of alleys I wanted her to know about. She had never flown in a helicopter. All those years of flying and 12,800 hours in flight time, and she had never flown with me before. And so I put her in the back seat and we flew with the doors off. And when we got over the area, I was gonna show her I did a heart right turn. Yeah, she's still pissed about that. How many of you have seen the Red Bull helicopter demonstration? Where he flies inverted in a Boeing 105. I got to go to Camilla, California and fly with Aaron Fitzgerald and fly the whole mission with him upside down in a helicopter, which most guys do. We've never done that. That's a very special helicopter he does it in. It shows my bald spot, which I'm not real happy with, but to go upside down in a helicopter was something I've looked forward to. I appreciate your consideration. If there are any questions, I would be glad to take them. You're not gonna ask me anything I haven't been asked before, and it certainly is no problem, so. Yes, ma'am.
Is that 2015 documentary available?
Well, let me tell you about that. Our financial backing, the guy that filmed it was an Academy Award winner named John Bruno. He did Ghostbusters and Jamie Lee Curtis, Arnold Schwarzenegger, True Lies, and a number of them. But our financial backing for the trip was a guy named Harvey Weinstein. So Harvey got himself in trouble, and it has not been finished yet. There is some talk, they're still talking about trying to get a little more back. I had a great time. It didn't, I went, they paid for it, and it was great fun. But Hollywood is a fickle lover. Yes, sir.
Lieutenant Colonel, thank you. Speaking of films, I wondered if you had any thoughts. I realize you can't speak from every possible perspective about films based on combat, fictional films, mass market films. Do you have any thoughts about the importance of accuracy, or is that something that really concerns you, whether we're talking about operational, technical, historical, when these films come out?
Nothing done on Vietnam meets my expectation. If you want a technically correct film, Saving Private Ryan, The Longest Day, A Band of Brothers, those were all great. Those were great pieces. But nothing on Vietnam meets my expectation. Yes, sir.
My friend produced a film Apocalypse Now, and Craig Fredericks, who did all the Godfather films. And that scene of the Dutch fighter pilot coming to drop napalm, how did you feel about with the ride of the Valkyrie playing in the background? You remember that scene?
Yeah, we did that. We did that. We had a Huey.
Well, did that make you feel, well, I'm sorry.
Well,
very upset by it.
We had a propaganda aircraft which had loudspeakers on the side, and we didn't do Ride of the Valkyrie, but we did the William Tell Overture a lot. That was a favorite of mine. The Robert Duvall depiction of the air cavalry commander was a little over the top, and Charlie don't serve.
Neither really is known Fredericks had ever served as a,
Yeah.
both of them were a little brain dead.
Most of the movies on Vietnam, I just don't care for them. We've never had a movie made in Vietnam, and I don't know that we ever will. The communist government there is.
Well, you remember Vietnam by David Monroe and Sean Pilzer. Do you know about that one?
Yeah.
Well, they were big friends of mine as well.
Yeah.
I'll tell you, my friend Captain Bob Miller won the Nobel Prize for stopping most of the nations in manufacturing anti-personnel mines, and he developed the first wheelchairs with old bicycle parts. And yet he was shot and crippled from the waist down and won the Silver Star. But there's a great scene of him being thrown over the barricade. Well, that's another whole story. Captain Bobby Mueller, Nobel Prize winner, man.
To your question, we've not had a movie that meets my expectation. Who else? Yes, Bob.
You were profiled in the segment of the military channel, got your St. Christopher medal.
Yeah.
I mean, that
The
doesn't
same
want to
thing.
hear about that.
Before I left Vietnam the first time, how many of you knew the Schmidt family? Jackie, John, Jack, Mary? Mary Schmidt, most elegant woman that ever walked the face of the earth. Jack Schmidt was the chef at the Holiday Inn and Jack's Steakhouse. John Schmidt, my classmate, was a diving buddy of mine. And Jackie was a year ahead. And when I got ready to go to Vietnam the first time, they were devout Catholics. And she came to me with a St. Christopher's medal. And she said, I want you to take this to Vietnam. I said, Jackie, I'm Presbyterian. I don't know that it'll work. But she says, we're going to go to the priest and we're going to get it blessed. And so we went to find the father over at St. John's, and Jackie said, Hugh's going to Vietnam. He goes, my goodness, that's a double whammy. And he blessed it twice. And I took that to Vietnam. I wore that St. Christopher's my entire tour, still have it today. And when we came home from Vietnam, I went to see the priest, and I said, I want to thank you for blessing my St. Christopher's, because it couldn't have hurt. And he had this strange look on his face, and he goes, Christopher, they decanonized him in July. He said, son, you've been flying on a recall saint. For the Catholics in the group, reorganization of the Catholic Church, 1969, that's where that came from. I think Christopher's back in good standing.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've got time for maybe one more question, and then the libraries can leave the room.
Okay. Yes, sir.
You pointed to two of the Vietnamese soldiers, Roy.
Roy and Toy.
People like that, what was their motivation to go to the South?
Either self-preservation in the face of what they saw as overwhelming firepower, or a change in political persuasion. I don't know. They served in almost every unit in Vietnam. There were a lot of Chew Hoys. They did yeoman's work. A lot of them died doing what they did. They were good soldiers. I couldn't speak to their motivation, because honestly, I never had a personal conversation with them, because they didn't speak the language.
Colonel, thank you for coming today. Knowing your love for Hot Springs, Liz and the volunteers have got you one of the famous Hot Springs t-shirts here. Thank you again.
I would just say, I have not lived in Hot Springs since I left in '66, but in every sense of the word, to me, this is home. Thank you very much.